Good morning. We are so glad to have you with us today. And whether you're on site or online, we invite you to live out our mission of learning to live a life of love. We do hope that if you live in the local area, that you'll join us in person next Sunday. We would love for you to be with us in person. But if on-site continues to be the best option for you, know that we have a lot of resources available for you. Our services are archived on our Facebook page. You can share them from there and watch them from there. On our website, we have our sermon content available to you. We have class content which is available to you. And you can pick up the Embrace, which is our weekly communication tool on our website. Finally, you can donate through our website and become a financial partner with us. We want to let you know, those of you who are members here at Stanford, that next week you'll get an email about Breeze. It's a new church database that we are rolling out, and it will be a great tool to help you connect with other people in many meaningful ways. In that email, you'll get a link. You'll click that link. You'll create a username and a password, and then we would love for you to do two things for us. Number one, upload a photo. And so you may want to download the app onto your phone, which will make it easier to upload a photo. And second, we would love for you to just fill out that contact information. That's the only way we know it's going to be your birthday. So fill out that contact information. Be watching for that email later this week. We were driving on the island of Negros in the Philippines. Our journey took us from one side of the island to the other side of the island, including across the mountains that stood in the middle of that island. I was a guest of two missionaries there. We were driving in their SUV. I remember a long, straight stretch of road across the mountain in the middle of the island when all of a sudden our lane veered to the right and the oncoming lane veered to their right. And where those two turns stood, also stood a giant tree. Here in the United States, we would have just cut that tree down and just let the road be straight. But our lane veered around the tree, the oncoming lane veered around the tree, and there that tree stood. I asked one of the missionaries what was going on, and she replied that the people who lived nearby believed that that tree was cursed. And whoever might chop down that tree would be cursed. And so no road crew could be found to mess with that tree. And so the tree stood and the roads went around the tree. Well, we might use the word enchanted to describe that part of the Philippines. To live in an enchanted world is to see the supernatural around every corner. It means to believe that God is present everywhere you look. Magic and divine and supernatural are just a common occurrence in life. And 500 years ago, that described much of the world around us. There was a strong cultural belief in the supernatural and in magic. And in communities of faith, there was a deep conviction that God was present and active everywhere you looked. The world was enchanted. But we might describe a road crew here in America as disenchanted. There's no way they would let that tree stand. There's no way they would believe that tree held any power over them, that God or gods or supernatural beings might be attached to that tree. And in many ways, that describes much of the world today. We live in a world that is disenchanted. Magic and the supernatural and divine occurrences are an uncommon part of life. In an enchanted world, God can hardly be missed. In a disenchanted world, God can hardly be seen. Now, these two words help describe the setting of two books in the Bible where we're going to spend the next 7 weeks. The book of Daniel and the book of Esther are written to people of faith, the Jewish people. These people are living in a disenchanted time, in a disenchanted place. They're living at a time and in a place where God can hardly be seen. The book of Daniel opens with the Jewish people forcibly taken from Jerusalem and transplanted to a place called Babylon. Daniel 1 verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. This is how the book of Daniel begins. The book of Daniel ends when Babylon is taken over by the nation of Persia. Chapter 1 verse 21. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Cyrus is a Persian king. The Persians take over Babylon, where Daniel and the Jewish people are. And the book of Esther then picks up the narrative close to that point, with the Jewish people continuing to live in what was once Babylon, is now Persia. And now they're living, by the time Esther comes along, under a king whose name is Xerxes or Ahasuerus. Babylon and Persia were places that to the Jewish people felt disenchanted. They were surrounded by a culture and by circumstances that seemed contrary to their spiritual beliefs and which made faith difficult to find. The book of Daniel and the book of Esther are written to help people of faith learn how to live with faith in times of disenchantment. Sometimes disenchantment comes in large, powerful events. For example, COVID made the entire last year a global time of disenchantment. Daniel and Esther are written to teach us how to have faith in years like that. Sometimes disenchantment comes into our lives in pointed, personal ways. I recently spoke to a young adult who said that he was walking away from the Christian faith because of intellectual doubts he had about the Bible and because of the way that Christian people had treated him. The books of Daniel and Esther are written to help people like him find faith when faith is hard to find. Now, surprisingly, these two books approach the same situation from different perspectives. The book of Daniel is filled with references to God. There are miracles like Daniel in the lion's den and Daniel's 3 friends surviving a fiery furnace. There are numerous divine visions and dreams. God is explicitly spoken of 3 times in the opening chapter. The book of Daniel is filled with God. The book of Esther is absent of God. The word God never even appears in the book of Esther. God is so absent in Esther that there was a long debate about whether or not it even belonged in the Bible. In the book of Daniel, God is center stage. He cannot be missed. In the book of Esther, God is backstage. He can hardly be seen. And both books explore how to find faith when faith is difficult to find. So this morning we begin a sermon series in the book of Daniel, lasts for 7 weeks, and we're going to begin by reflecting on Daniel chapter 1. This chapter is written to help us understand what it feels like when it feels like God is no longer in charge. We find at least 3 things in this chapter that would lead people of faith to feel like God is no longer in charge. First, we're told that the Babylonian army not only transplanted Jewish people to Babylon, they transplanted sacred artifacts to Babylon as well. They stole artifacts from the temple in Jerusalem and placed them in the temples in Babylon. Verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. This was a common practice in the ancient Near East. It was a way of demonstrating the superiority of your gods in contrast to the gods of the people that you had just overcome. It would definitely make you feel like your God is no longer in control. Second, Daniel and his three friends are forced to take on new names, which exalt the gods of the Babylonians. We read about this in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 6. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Daniel and his three Jewish friends have Jewish names which contain elements of the name of God. They are given new names which contain elements for the names of the Babylonian gods. Daniel, which means God is my judge, is changed to Belteshazzar. May a God protect his life. Azariah, meaning Yah or God is my help, is renamed Abednego, servant of the god Nabu. Hananiah, whose name means Yah or God has been gracious, is given the new name Shadrach, a form of the name of the Babylonian god Marduk. Mishael, whose name means who is what God is given the new name Meshach, another form of the name of the Babylonian god Marduk. And their new names are intended to make them feel like their God, who they used to be named after, is no longer in charge. And then third, Daniel and his three friends are forced into an educational system designed to indoctrinate them in Babylonian values. We read about this beginning of verse 3. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. The Babylonians intend to indoctrinate Daniel and his three friends so that they no longer believe that their God is in control. It would feel from these three details that God was nowhere to be found. God had been defeated. His people were on their own. They were all alone. How many times have you watched bad things happen and felt like God has been defeated? God is nowhere to be found. You are all alone. Mother Teresa was widely known for founding the Missionaries of Charity and for serving the poorest of the poor. She received the Nobel Prize. She was designated as a saint after her death by the Catholic Church. During her life, she was frequently pointed to as a marvelous example of faith and love. And indeed, she was. But she was also someone who experienced disenchantment. After her death, in a collection of her correspondence published in a book called Come Be My Light, many people were surprised to hear at this prolonged period of disenchantment in her life. In fact, for a period of 50 years, Teresa experienced distance from God and darkness in her life. It turned out, impossible to spend your life ministering in the midst of such injustice, such brokenness, such darkness, and not be deeply impacted yourself. She wrote, "If I ever become a saint, I will surely be one of darkness." That is what Esther and Daniel teach us. They teach us how to be saints of darkness, how to be saints in times of disenchantment. They teach us how to find faith when faith is hard to find. Thankfully, Daniel chapter 1 does this in a hope-filled way. At least 3 times in Daniel 1, we're given details that might lead us to conclude that God is no longer in charge. And 3 times in Daniel chapter 1, we are given language meant to prove that God is still in charge. Daniel 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Verse 9. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. Verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. The author wants us to know that God is still present and active. He is still providing for his people. He is still presiding over global history. All appearances are that the Babylonians are in charge. But what the author wants us to know is that God is still in charge. And this explains one small and confusing detail in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel refuses to eat food from the king and wine from the king. Verse 5. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. Verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Now Daniel's refusal to eat some of the food from the king and the wine from the king does not seem to be based only on Jewish dietary laws. It is not that Daniel is simply trying to be kosher. If that were the reason for his restrictions, he wouldn't have refrained from the wine, which was not restricted by Jewish law. Daniel's refusal also does not seem to be based only on concerns of idolatry. Now, this food would have been offered to a Babylonian god before it was then brought to the king and the court and those who are in the court, just as in Jewish theology. So in Babylonian theology, this food, as it was offered up to God or gods, would have created some perception of connection between those eating and the one to whom it had been offered. And yet, Daniel does not refrain from all food. He still eats the vegetables, which presumably would have also been offered to these gods. I think something else is going on here. Daniel and his 3 friends are having their minds and their bodies fed by the Babylonian court. The Babylonians want them to prosper and to thrive intellectually and physically. And Daniel and his 3 friends submit to this, but only to a point. They will allow their names to be changed. They will attend the education. They will eat the food, but only some of it. Why? They wanted something that would remind themselves and those nearby that any thriving or prospering they experienced was not the result of the Babylonians. It was a result of their God. This God who still ruled, this God who is still present despite all appearances. In refusing some food and relishing other food, every meal at Daniel's table rewrote their tale of disenchantment into a tale of enchantment. Every crunch of a vegetable, every sip of clear water reminded them and those who knew of their table practice that Daniel's God was still active, even in the darkness. Every time someone called their new names, or every time they stepped into the Babylonian classroom, they may have felt the weight of disenchantment. But every time they sat down to eat vegetables and drink water, that weight would have been lifted. They were giving themselves, and the Babylonians, who knew of their practice, a chance to consider that it was God who was behind any success they had, and not the Babylonians. Now, admittedly, this feels strange and hardly something that might benefit us. Go and eat your vegetables, drink plenty of water, are not the kind of things you want to hear in a sermon when you're struggling to find faith in difficult times. But while this specific practice may not translate well, there are other practices that make use of the same principle. We need practices now, like Daniel's practice then, habits that rewrite our tales of disenchantment into tales of enchantment. For some of you, this may mean simply taking time at the end of every day and thanking God for a few things. For some of you, this may mean simply beginning every day with the very same prayer. For some of you, maybe this means reading one psalm at lunch as a way of reconnecting with God. For some of you, this might mean taking a long walk every day you can, just to be reminded of the creative powers of God. The key is to find something, anything really, that you can practice on a daily basis, a habit that will remind you that despite what you see, despite what you hear, despite what you feel, God is near. God is behind you. God believes in you. God loves you. And He is here for you. I'll close with part of a prayer from St. Patrick, a prayer that itself was designed to re-enchant our lives by reminding us of the nearness of Christ. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me.